My wife went to a party against my wishes, so I ghosted her. Years later, she showed up at my door. What would you do if the person you vowed to forget appeared on your doorstep, drenched by the rain, begging for a moment of your time? Why did she return after all these years? What is she hiding? Will you open the door to the truth? Or will the past consume you both? Dive into a tale of love, betrayal, and the shadows that linger long after the lights go out. Sometimes, the past is the most dangerous place to be. The evening sky wept a relentless, sorrowful rain, its tears blurring the edges of the world outside. It was as if the heavens themselves mourned the lost years, mirroring the desolation that had settled deep within my heart. I had long since given up expecting visitors, especially anyone from my past. So when the doorbell's sharp ring pierced through the steady drumming of rain, it was more of an annoyance than a curiosity. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Who could it possibly be? A neighbor with a misdelivered package? A salesman defying the storm for one last pitch? I almost turned back, but something, perhaps an old instinct, something buried deep within, urged me forward. The door creaked open, and there she stood, Alina. My breath caught in my throat. Alina, my ex-wife, the woman I had sworn never to see again. The rain had soaked her completely, her once vibrant eyes now dulled by something I couldn't quite name. Regret, desperation, maybe even fear. "Dominic," she began, her voice trembling, the sound barely carrying over the rain. "I need to talk to you." For a moment, I was frozen, staring at her as a flood of memories surged up from the depths where I had buried them. There was a time when her presence would have filled me with warmth, with joy. But those days were gone, buried beneath the rubble of betrayal and the cold, hard stone of resentment. "What are you doing here, Alina?" The words came out colder than I intended, each syllable laced with the bitterness that had festered in the years since she had left. Her eyes, once so full of life, flickered with something that might have been hope, or perhaps just the last remnants of pride. "Please, Dominic, I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I need to explain. About that night, about everything." I felt the old wounds beginning to reopen, the pain I had tried so hard to forget bubbling to the surface. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to banish her from my life forever. But another part, perhaps the part that still remembered the love we had once shared, held me back. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside, allowing her entry. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps some lingering need for closure, but whatever it was, I couldn't turn her away. She stepped into the foyer, her clothes clinging to her, water pooling around her feet on the hardwood floor. I watched as she nervously twisted her fingers together, a habit I remembered all too well. She had always done that when she was anxious, and seeing it again brought a pang of something close to nostalgia. "Why now?" I asked, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. "Why? After all this time?" Alina looked down, seemingly gathering her thoughts before she spoke again. "I've spent the last few years trying to make sense of everything, trying to find a way to make things right. I know I hurt you, Dominic. I know that night changed everything between us. But there are things you don't know, things I didn't understand myself until it was too late." I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall, my posture as defensive as my words. "You made your choice, Alina. You chose to go to that party, to ignore everything I said. And now, after all these years, you show up here expecting what? Forgiveness. Understanding." She flinched as if my words had struck her physically, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dominic. I just want you to hear me out. I need you to know that I didn't betray you, not in the way you think." The pain in her voice was palpable, but it wasn't enough to soften the walls I had built around my heart. "You made your bed, Alina. Now you have to lie in it." There was a long, heavy silence, thick with all the words that had gone unsaid over the years, all the emotions that had been left unresolved. I could see the struggle in her eyes, the battle between pride and vulnerability. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Dominic, just give me a chance to explain." I sighed, running a hand through my hair, a gesture that was as much about buying time as it was about frustration. "Fine. Talk. But don't expect anything from me, Elena. I've moved on, and you should too." She nodded, a single tear escaping down her cheek, mixing with the rainwater still clinging to her skin. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice laced with a mix of relief and sorrow. As I led her into the living room, I couldn't help but wonder if I was making a mistake. Letting her back into my life, even for a moment, felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. But there was no turning back now. Whatever she had to say, I was ready to hear it, even if it only served to confirm what I had believed all along, that the woman I once loved was lost to me forever. The night that changed everything was not born from a single moment of madness, but rather the culmination of months of quiet discontent, of festering disagreements, and unspoken frustrations. It was like a fault line slowly cracking beneath the surface, unseen until the pressure became too great, and the inevitable rupture shattered everything we had built. It was a Friday evening, and I had just returned from work, exhaustion weighing heavily on my shoulders. The prospect of a quiet night at home was the only thing that had kept me going through the day. But as I stepped through the door, the sight of Elena standing in front of the mirror, meticulously applying makeup, sent a jolt of unease through me. "What's the occasion?" I asked, doing my best to keep my tone light, though there was an unmistakable edge to it. Elena barely glanced at me before returning her focus to her reflection. "Ariana's having a party tonight. I told you about it last week, remember?" I did remember, though vaguely. Ariana, Elena's best friend, was someone I had never warmed to. Her parties were notorious for their wildness, the kind of gatherings where boundaries blurred and consequences were an afterthought. It was a world I had outgrown long ago, but Elena, it seemed, had not. "I thought we agreed you wouldn't go," I said, trying to suppress the irritation that crept into my voice. "It's not exactly the kind of place you should be hanging out." Elena sighed, setting down her mascara before turning to face me. Her expression was a mix of frustration and impatience. "Dominic, it's just a party. It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal, Elena," I insisted, stepping closer to her. "You know the kind of people Ariana invites to these things. It's not safe, and frankly, it's not appropriate for a married woman to be going to these kinds of parties, especially dressed like that." Her eyes narrowed at my words, her posture stiffening. "What's wrong with how I'm dressed?" she challenged, her voice rising slightly. The dress she wore was sleek, form-fitting, designed to attract attention. Attention I didn't want her seeking. "It's too revealing," I said bluntly. "You're going to a party full of drunk guys who don't care that you're married. I don't want you putting yourself in that situation." Elena crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "I'm not a child, Dominic. I can take care of myself. And I'm not going alone. I'm going with a colleague from work." "A colleague?" The word felt like a slap in the face. "A male colleague, I assume." "Yes, a male colleague," she replied, her voice dripping with exasperation. "For God's sake, Dominic, it's just a party. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" "Because it is a big deal." I snapped, the anger I had been holding back finally spilling over. "You're going out with another man, to a party full of people who don't respect our marriage, wearing a dress that practically screams, 'Look at me.' And you expect me to be okay with that?" She threw her hands up in frustration. "I'm not doing anything wrong. You're being paranoid and controlling, and I'm sick of it. I'm going to the party, whether you like it or not." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always trusted Elena, but this was different. This wasn't just about the party. It was about respect, about the vows we had made to each other. And in that moment, it felt like she was throwing it all away. "You go to that party, Elena, and we're done," I said, my voice cold and final. Do you understand me? I'm not going to sit here and watch you make a fool of me." She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," I said, my tone leaving no room for doubt. "You make your choice." For a moment, I thought she would back down, that she would see reason. But instead, she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and said, "Fine. Then I guess we're done." Without another word, she grabbed her purse and walked out the door, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. The sound of the door closing behind her was like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I stood there for what felt like hours, replaying the argument in my head, trying to make sense of how we had gotten to this point. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I had been right. This wasn't just about a party. It was about the erosion of trust, about the slow decay of a relationship that had once meant everything to me. As the rain continued to pour outside, I realized that something had irrevocably changed between us. The fault line had split wide open, and there was no going back. The morning after our confrontation, I woke to an unfamiliar silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. The house, once filled with the warmth of shared life, now felt cold and empty, as if it had absorbed the tension and despair of the previous night. The absence of Elena was a void, a gaping hole that seemed to echo with the unresolved conflict between us. I moved through the motions of brewing coffee, but my mind was elsewhere, fixated on the one person who had always been a thorn in our relationship, Ariana. She had been a constant presence in Elena's life, a friend who had somehow become an unavoidable third party in our marriage. From the moment I met her, I had felt uneasy. There was something about Ariana that didn't sit right with me, a feeling that only grew stronger with time. Ariana was the kind of person who thrived on chaos. She was bold, unapologetically so, with a flair for the dramatic that often spilled over into the lives of those around her. Her parties were infamous, filled with people who seemed to live only for the next thrill, the next escape from reality. To Elena, Ariana was a free spirit, someone who defied convention and lived life on her own terms. But to me, she was reckless, a force of disruption that I could never quite trust. As I sipped my coffee, my thoughts drifted back to the many nights Elena had spent with Ariana, nights that always seemed to end in arguments, in questions that never had satisfying answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ariana was pulling Elena away from me, leading her down a path that could only end in disaster. She was the one who encouraged Elena to dress provocatively, to flirt with other men, to act as if she were still single. It was as if Ariana wanted to see our marriage fail, and Elena, blinded by loyalty, couldn't or wouldn't see it. That evening, as the rain outside finally began to let up, Elena returned home. Her mood was guarded, her expression carefully neutral, but the tension between us was palpable. The argument from the night before hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I knew we needed to address it before it festered further. "Can we talk?" I asked, setting my cup down on the counter as she kicked off her shoes by the door. Elena hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "It's about Ariana. I know she's your best friend, but I really think she's having a negative influence on you, on us." Elena's eyes rolled slightly, a gesture I had come to expect whenever the subject of Ariana came up. "Dominic, we've been through this before. Ariana is my friend. Just because you don't like her doesn't mean she's a bad person." "I never said she's a bad person," I countered, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. "But you have to admit, she doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to relationships. Every time you two go out, it ends in some kind of drama." Elena sighed, clearly frustrated by the conversation. "You're making it sound like she's some sort of villain, and that's not fair. Ariana's been there for me when no one else was. She's helped me through some really tough times. I'm not going to turn my back on her just because you don't approve of her lifestyle." "It's not about me disapproving of her lifestyle," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's about how her choices are affecting our marriage. Every time you go out with her, we end up fighting. She's not just living her life, she's dragging you into her messes, and it's pulling us apart. Elena looked at me, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. Dominic, I'm not a puppet. Ariana doesn't control me. I make my own choices, and if those choices bother you, maybe you need to look at why that is. Her words stung, a sharp rebuke that cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I could feel the walls between us growing higher, the distance that had begun to form now threatening to become an insurmountable barrier. I'm not saying you're a puppet, Elena, but I am saying that you need to think about the kind of influence Ariana has on you. I love you, and I want what's best for us, for our marriage. But I can't do that if you're constantly choosing her over me. Elena's eyes softened, but there was still a stubborn set to her jaw. Dominic, I love you too, but Ariana is important to me, and I'm not going to abandon her just because you don't like her. I can be friends with her and still be a good wife. The two aren't mutually exclusive. I wanted to believe her, to take comfort in her words, but the doubt gnawed at me, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind. I hope you're right, Elena, because I don't know how much more of this I can take. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently, her touch warm and familiar. We'll figure it out, Dominic. We always do. But even as she said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already been lost, that the woman standing before me was no longer the same person I had married. The influence of Ariana, whether Elena wanted to admit it or not, was changing her, and I wasn't sure if our marriage could survive it. The tension in our home had been simmering for days, a palpable undercurrent that neither of us could ignore. Each passing moment felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something neither of us wanted to confront but knew was coming all the same. I could sense the breaking point approaching, like a storm building on the horizon, and it terrified me. It was another Friday evening, and Elena was getting ready to go out again. She had mentioned earlier in the week that Ariana was hosting another one of her infamous parties, and I had done my best to suppress the rising tide of dread and disapproval. But as the day approached, the weight of my concerns grew too heavy to bear. I watched her from the doorway as she stood in front of the mirror, applying the final touches to her makeup. She looked stunning, as always, but the dress she wore left little to the imagination. It wasn't just the dress, though. It was everything it represented. The late nights, the questionable company, the growing distance between us. Each time she left for one of these parties, it felt like she was slipping further away from me, from us. Elena, we need to talk, I said, my voice tense with the effort of holding back my emotions. She glanced at me through the mirror, her expression wary. Can it wait, Dominic? I'm already running late. I shook my head, feeling the urgency of the moment pressing down on me. No, it can't. This has gone on long enough. I'm not comfortable with you going to that party tonight. Not like this. Elena turned to face me, her brow furrowing in frustration. Dominic, we've been over this. I'm going out with my friends. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal, I insisted, taking a step closer. It's not just about tonight. It's about everything that's been happening. The late nights, the parties, Ariana's influence. It's pulling us apart, Elena. She crossed her arms, her stance defensive. I'm not a child, Dominic. I can make my own decisions. You don't get to control what I do or who I spend time with. I'm not trying to control you, I replied, struggling to keep my voice calm. But I am your husband, and I have a say in this marriage. I can't just stand by and watch as you make choices that are hurting us, hurting what we've built together. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. Hurting us? You're the one who's always making a big deal out of nothing. Ariana's my friend. We're just having fun. Why can't you understand that? Because it's not just fun anymore. I snapped, unable to hold back any longer. It's more than that. It's disrespectful to our marriage. Every time you go out like this, it feels like you're choosing Ariana over me, over us. She took a step back, her expression hardening. You're overreacting, Dominic. I'm not choosing anyone over you. But I'm not going to stop living my life just because you don't approve of my friends. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, the words forming before I could think to stop them. If you walk out that door tonight, Alina, don't expect me to be here when you get back. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the shock in her eyes, quickly replaced by anger. Are you giving me an ultimatum? I nodded, my jaw clenched. Yes, I am. I'm tired of this, Alina. I'm tired of feeling like I'm the only one fighting for our marriage. If you go to that party tonight, if you walk out that door, then you're making your choice, and I'll make mine. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me as if she couldn't believe what I was saying. Then her expression hardened, and she grabbed her purse from the table. Fine, Dominic. If that's how you feel, maybe you're right. Maybe we do need some space. I watched, helpless, as she walked to the door, her heels clicking against the floor with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest as the reality of what I had just done began to sink in. I had given her an ultimatum, drawn a line in the sand that I never thought we would cross. Alina, I called out, my voice softer now, almost pleading. But she didn't turn back. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that echoed in the silence of our home, leaving me standing there, alone, with the weight of my words hanging in the air. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the closed door, the enormity of what had just happened washing over me in waves. The storm had finally broken, and I was left standing in its wake, unsure if there was anything left to salvage. The night felt colder than any I could remember, the chill seeping into my bones as I sat alone in the dark, staring at the door that had closed behind Alina just hours earlier. The silence in the house was oppressive, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on me, amplifying the storm of emotions raging inside. I had always been able to control my anger, to keep it in check, but now it was a living thing, clawing at my insides, demanding to be unleashed. I kept telling myself that she would come back, that she would realize what was at stake, and turn around before it was too late. But as the minutes stretched into hours, hope faded, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that threatened to consume me. At some point, I must have drifted into an uneasy sleep, my mind too exhausted to keep fighting the thoughts that plagued me. But the sharp ring of my phone jolted me awake, the sound tearing through the quiet of the night like a siren. Disoriented, I fumbled for the phone, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight. The sight of Ariana's name flashing on the screen sent a surge of anxiety through me. Why would she be calling me? What could she possibly have to say? I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding in my chest. Hello? Ariana's voice on the other end was slurred, dripping with the mockery I had come to expect from her. Dominic, darling. Guess who's having the time of her life? What are you talking about, Ariana? I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands had started to tremble. Oh, don't pretend like you don't know, she drawled, the words laced with a cruel amusement. Alina's the star of the show tonight. You should see her, dancing, laughing, having the time of her life. Seems like she's forgotten all about you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew she was trying to provoke me, to push my buttons, but the image of Alina at that party, surrounded by strangers, sent a wave of panic through me. Put Alina on the phone, I demanded, my voice strained, the tension making it hard to breathe. Ariana laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent a chill down my spine. Oh, I'm afraid she's a bit too occupied right now. Maybe she'll call you when she's done with her friends. Or maybe not. Damn it, Ariana. Put her on the phone. I shouted, the panic turning into anger, the need to hear Alina's voice overwhelming every other thought. But there was only more laughter on the other end before the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, the silence in the room now more oppressive than ever. Rage and fear twisted inside me, a toxic mix that made it impossible to think straight. I didn't know what to do, how to reach her. The house felt like a prison, each passing second dragging me deeper into a spiral of despair. Finally, unable to sit still any longer, I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, not even sure where I was going. My mind was a blur of images: Alina laughing with strangers, Ariana's mocking face, and the dark, twisted possibilities of what could happen to her at that party. I drove through the city, the streets eerily quiet, every red light and turn filling me with frustration. When I finally arrived at Ariana's place, the party was in full swing. The music was deafening, the kind of mindless beat that thumped through the walls and made the windows vibrate. I pushed my way through the crowd, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed me as I searched for Alina. My heart dropped when I finally spotted her in the corner of the room, slumped on a couch with a glass in her hand, her head lolled to one side. She looked disoriented, her eyes glazed over as if she wasn't really seeing anything. I rushed to her side, my heart pounding in my chest. "Alina, what happened? Are you okay?" I asked, gently shaking her shoulder. She mumbled something incoherent, her body limp and unresponsive. Panic seized me as I realized something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just alcohol. Someone had drugged her. "Help me get her out of here." I shouted to no one in particular, but the partygoers around us either ignored me or stared with detached curiosity. Ariana sauntered over, a smirk on her face. "What's the matter, Dominic? Can't handle a little fun?" "What did you do to her?" I growled, my hands shaking with the urge to lash out, my voice barely controlled. Ariana shrugged, her expression infuriatingly casual. "Relax, she's just had a little too much to drink. She'll be fine." "You lying?" I started, but I knew this wasn't the time to get into it with Ariana. I needed to get Alina out of there. I managed to lift Alina to her feet, though she was barely able to stand. The drive home was a nightmare, every red light feeling like an eternity, as Alina drifted in and out of consciousness beside me. When we finally got home, I helped her to the bathroom, where she promptly threw up everything she had consumed that night. The next morning, Alina woke up with no memory of what had happened. She was groggy, disoriented, and I could see the fear in her eyes as the realization that something terrible had occurred began to sink in. "What happened last night, Dominic?" she asked, her voice trembling as she clutched the blanket around her. I hesitated, not wanting to add to her distress, but she needed to know. "Someone drugged you at the party, Alina. I found you barely conscious when I got there." Her face went pale, and she shook her head in disbelief. "I don't remember anything. How could this happen?" "It was Ariana," I said, my voice cold, my anger barely restrained. "She's the one who called me, taunting me. She knew what was happening, and she didn't stop it." Alina's eyes filled with tears, the shock and betrayal written all over her face. "But why? Why would she do that?" "Because she doesn't care about you, Alina," I said, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. "She's always been toxic, always pushing you to do things you shouldn't. And now this is the result." Alina covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. I wanted to comfort her, but the anger I felt was too raw, too overwhelming. Instead, I stood there, watching as the woman I loved broke down in front of me, knowing that the damage had been done, damage that couldn't be undone. A morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the bedroom where Alina lay, still curled up under the blanket, her face turned away from me. The events of the previous night weighed heavily in the room, an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to address. I had spent the night on the couch, my mind a restless tangle of anger, confusion, and guilt. The only thing I knew for certain was that nothing would ever be the same between us. I watched her for a moment, my emotions a conflicted storm of resentment and sorrow. Part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But another part, perhaps the larger part, was still consumed by the anger that had been simmering inside me for so long. I felt betrayed, not just by Ariana, but by Elena too. She had gone to that party against my wishes, despite knowing how much it hurt me. And now, here we were, with our lives unraveling because of that decision. I needed to get out of the house to clear my head. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, suffocating me. Without waking Elena, I grabbed my coat and keys and left, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that echoed the decision I was trying to avoid making. The cool morning air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside. I got into the car and just drove, not caring where I was going. I needed space, distance, anything to help me think straight. My mind was a mess, a tangled web of emotions I couldn't sort through. The anger was the worst of it. This seething, boiling rage that made me want to punch something, anything. But beneath that anger was something worse, something I didn't want to admit to myself. Fear. Fear of what this meant for us, for our marriage. Fear that things were broken beyond repair. I drove aimlessly through the city, the familiar streets passing by in a blur. Eventually, I ended up at the one place I never thought I'd go, Ariana's apartment. I didn't even remember deciding to come here, but somehow, this is where I had landed. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I stared up at the building, the rage bubbling up again. I hated Ariana for what she had done, but part of me knew that the real reason I was here wasn't just about confronting her. It was about trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I needed answers, something to help me understand why Elena had made the choices she had. I took a deep breath and got out of the car, heading inside. The elevator ride up to Ariana's floor felt like an eternity, the anticipation and anger making my heart pound. When I reached her door, I didn't hesitate. I banged on it with enough force to make the whole building shake. Ariana opened the door, a smirk already forming on her lips when she saw me. Well, if it isn't the dutiful husband, what brings you here? Cut the crap, Ariana. I snapped, pushing past her and into the apartment. What the hell were you thinking? You let her get hurt. You did nothing to stop it. She closed the door behind me, unbothered by my anger. Elena is a grown woman, Dominic. She makes her own choices. Or have you forgotten that? She was drugged. She could have been seriously hurt or worse. I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. Ariana shrugged, her face a mask of indifference. And yet, here she is, safe and sound, thanks to you. What's the problem? The problem is you, I accused, my hands shaking with the effort to keep from losing control completely. You've been poisoning her mind, pushing her to do things she wouldn't normally do. Poisoning her mind, she repeated, a mocking tone in her voice. Please, Elena is her own person, Dominic. Maybe you should stop trying to control her and start listening to what she wants. I was taken aback by her words, the accusation hitting closer to home than I wanted to admit. But I wasn't ready to back down. This isn't about control, Ariana. This is about trust. You've been manipulating her, pushing her to make bad decisions, and now she's paying the price. Ariana rolled her eyes, clearly bored with the conversation. You know what your problem is, Dominic. You think you can keep her in a bubble, protect her from the world. But that's not how life works. People make mistakes. They get hurt. They learn from it. You can't shield her from everything. I stared at her, the truth in her words twisting the knife in my gut. But it didn't change the fact that Elena was lying at home, shattered because of what had happened. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all slipping through my fingers, that I was losing her. Without another word, I turned and left the apartment, slamming the door behind me. The drive home was a blur, my mind spinning with everything Ariana had said. I didn't want to believe her, but I couldn't deny that there was a grain of truth in her words. I had tried to protect Elena, to keep her safe, but in doing so, had I pushed her away. When I got home, Elena was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. Dominic, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I wanted to prove that I could make my own decisions, that I wasn't just following your rules. I closed my eyes, her words hitting me like a blow. I was only trying to protect you, Elena. But maybe I went too far. Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. I know you were, but I felt trapped, like I couldn't breathe. I just wanted to feel like I had control over my own life. I sat down next to her, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I don't know how we fix this, Elena. I don't know if we can. She reached out, taking my hand in hers. We can, Dominic. We just need to find a way back to each other. But as I sat there, holding her hand, the doubts lingered in the back of my mind. Could we really find our way back from this? Or had too much damage been done? The days that followed were a blur of confusion, pain, and a growing sense of helplessness. Elena's physical injuries were minor, but the emotional scars ran deep, and as the reality of what had happened began to sink in, so too did the need for justice. Elena, once so full of life and determination, now seemed like a shadow of her former self, haunted by the memories of that night. She became consumed with the idea of holding those responsible accountable, and I watched as her obsession with justice grew, pulling her further away from me. Elena hired a lawyer, Karen Reynolds, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fighting tooth and nail for her clients. Karen exuded a confidence that was both reassuring and intimidating, and when she walked into our living room for the first time, it was as if she brought with her a small glimmer of hope that had been absent since that fateful night. Elena, Karen said as she entered, her expression serious but kind. I've reviewed the evidence, and we have a strong case. Ariana's involvement is clear. But we need to gather more evidence to secure a conviction. This won't be easy, but we'll fight every step of the way. Elena nodded, her face pale but resolute. I want to see this through, Karen. I want to hold them accountable. I stood quietly in the background, feeling like an outsider in this battle that had become Elena's singular focus. Our relationship, already strained, seemed to fray further with each passing day. I wanted to support her, to be the husband she needed, but I struggled with my own conflicting emotions, anger at what had happened, guilt for not preventing it, and a deep-seated fear that our marriage might not survive this ordeal. The legal battle was grueling, stretching out over weeks that turned into months. There were depositions, evidence gathering, and the relentless back and forth of courtroom drama. Ariana's defense was as ruthless as it was relentless. Her lawyer, Richard Cole, was a man who clearly thrived on destroying his opponents, and he employed every tactic at his disposal to discredit Elena, to paint her as someone who had willingly put herself in a dangerous situation. It was a brutal strategy, and I could see the toll it took on Elena as the case dragged on. One day, as I accompanied Elena to yet another court hearing, I witnessed firsthand the harsh reality of the legal system. Richard Cole's cross-examination was vicious, designed to break Elena's spirit, to undermine her credibility in front of the jury. I watched helplessly as Elena sat on the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she answered his pointed, invasive questions. Ms. Warren, Richard Cole began, his tone dripping with skepticism. You're claiming that you were drugged and assaulted, yet there's no physical evidence to support this. No witnesses who saw the attack occur. How can you be certain of what happened? Elena's eyes flickered with the pain of the memories, but she held her ground. I know what happened to me. I was drugged, and I have no memory of the assault because of it. I've been through medical evaluations and psychological assessments that support my claim. Richard Cole nodded, a predatory smile playing on his lips as he paced in front of the jury. Yet you willingly went to a party where you were surrounded by people you didn't know well. Isn't it true that you made poor choices that night? Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to back down. I went to the party because I wanted to assert my independence. I didn't expect to be drugged and assaulted. My choices that night don't negate what was done to me. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the atmosphere charged with the weight of every word spoken. Karen Reynolds was quick to counter, her own line of questioning designed to reframe the narrative and highlight the pattern of Ariana's behavior. But the damage had been done. I could see the strain on Alina's face, the exhaustion in her eyes, and it broke my heart to see her suffering like this. Despite the emotional toll, Alina remained resolute, her determination shining through even in the darkest moments. She was fighting not just for herself, but for something bigger, a sense of justice, of reclaiming the control that had been stolen from her. And in the end, that determination paid off. The court ruled in Alina's favor. Ariana and another man, who had been complicit in the assault, were found liable for their actions. The judgment brought some measure of justice, a validation of everything Alina had endured, but it did little to heal the deep emotional wounds she had suffered. The legal victory, though significant, felt hollow in the face of the damage it had caused. To Alina, to us, to everything we had once believed was unshakable. As we left the courthouse that day, the weight of the victory pressing down on us, I realized that our battle was far from over. The court had ruled in our favor, but the fractures in our marriage had only deepened. I wasn't sure how to move forward, or if moving forward was even possible. The victory in court was bittersweet, serving as a harsh reminder of everything we had lost. And as we walked to the car in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been irrevocably broken. In the days following the court's decision, life didn't return to normal. In fact, it seemed as though any semblance of normalcy had been shattered. The judgment, though a victory, left a void where closure should have been. The triumph we sought felt like a Pyrrhic victory, and the fractures in our relationship became chasms that seemed impossible to bridge. Alina and I existed in the same house, but on different planes of reality. We spoke in measured tones, our conversations clipped and practical, devoid of the warmth and intimacy that had once defined our marriage. There were no more arguments, but there was no laughter either, just a pervasive silence that settled over us like a heavy fog, obscuring any path forward. Alina had withdrawn into herself, spending long hours alone, her focus turned inward as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She had won her battle in court, but the scars left by the ordeal were deep, and I could see that she was struggling to find a way to heal. I wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but every time I tried, it felt as though an invisible wall stood between us, something intangible yet impenetrable. One evening, as the autumn wind howled outside and the leaves scattered across the lawn, I found myself standing at the threshold of the bedroom we once shared. Alina was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She looked so small, so fragile in that moment, that it broke something inside me. I couldn't bear the silence any longer. "Alina," I said softly, stepping into the room. She didn't turn to face me, but I saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself so tightly, as if she feared she might shatter as she let go. "Yes." Her voice was flat, almost distant, as though she were speaking from a place far away. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. "We need to talk. About us. About what's happened." She didn't respond immediately, and when she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know if there's anything left to say, Dominic. I don't know if there's anything left of us." Her words were like a knife to the heart, cutting through the last of my defenses. "Alina, I know things have been difficult. I know I made mistakes. But we can't keep living like this. We need to find a way to move forward." She finally turned to look at me, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow, as though all the tears she had shed had drained the life from them. "Move forward to what, Dominic? What's left? We've been through so much, too much. I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore, let alone who we are." I crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, the distance between us feeling like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. "I don't have all the answers, Alina. I wish I did. But I know that I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we had." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in that familiar nervous habit, And I realized that it was the first time in weeks I had seen her so vulnerable, so exposed. "What we had," she began, her voice trembling. "It's gone, Dominic. I don't know how to get it back. I don't even know if we can." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and final, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. This was the reality we had been avoiding, the truth neither of us wanted to face, that the foundation of our marriage had been cracked, perhaps irreparably, and that no amount of effort could make it whole again. But even as I sat there, wrestling with the reality of our situation, a small part of me refused to give up. "Elena, I know it feels hopeless right now, but we've been through so much together. We've faced so many challenges. We can't just let it all go. We owe it to ourselves to try, to fight for what we had." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the pain in her eyes, the doubt, but also a flicker of something else, something that gave me a glimmer of hope. "How, Dominic? How do we even begin to fix this? After everything that's happened, how do we find our way back?" I reached out, taking her hand in mine, feeling the coolness of her skin against my warmth. "We start by talking, by being honest with each other. We've been avoiding the truth for too long, hiding behind our anger and our pain. We need to face it together." She hesitated for a moment, then squeezed my hand, a small gesture that felt like a lifeline in the storm of uncertainty. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We'll try." That night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we talked, really talked. We didn't solve all our problems, and there were still so many things left unsaid, but it was a start. It was a step toward each other, a tentative bridge across the divide that had grown between us. As the night wore on, the words began to flow more easily, and the silence that had once been so suffocating was replaced by the soft murmur of voices reaching out to one another in the darkness. As we sat there, side by side, I realized that the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with uncertainties and challenges. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The days after our conversation were marked by a fragile truce, a tentative peace that felt as though it could shatter at any moment. But it was a start, and for that, I was grateful. The wounds we had inflicted on each other were still raw, and the path to healing seemed impossibly long. But for the first time in months, it felt like we were at least facing the same direction. Elena began to open up to me in small, careful steps. The walls she had built around herself, the barriers that had kept us apart, were slowly coming down, brick by brick. We talked more, not just about the trauma she had endured or the trial that had consumed our lives, but about everything. The little things that had once been the glue of our relationship. We reminisced about the early days, the moments of laughter and joy that had once defined our life together. It was a way of reminding ourselves of what we had been, of the love that had once been so strong. But the road to healing was not a straight one. There were setbacks, moments when the weight of everything we had been through threatened to pull us back into the darkness. Elena would sometimes retreat into herself, her emotions too overwhelming to face, and I had to learn to be patient, to give her the space she needed. It was hard, harder than I had imagined. The impulse to fix everything, to make it all better, was strong, but I knew that healing wasn't something that could be forced. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, the warmth of a fire crackling in the hearth, Elena turned to me, her expression serious, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Dominic," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about everything that's happened between us." I nodded, waiting for her to continue, sensing that this was one of those moments that could either bring us closer or push us apart. "I've realized," she said, choosing her words carefully, "that I've been blaming myself for a lot of things. For the way our marriage has struggled, for the choices I made, even for what happened at the party. But I also know that it wasn't just me. We both made mistakes. We both let things get to a point where we didn't know how to find each other anymore." Her words were like a balm, soothing and painful all at once. Elena, I blamed myself too. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us. But I see now that I was trying to control something that I couldn't control. I wasn't listening to you, to what you needed. She reached out and took my hand, her touch light but grounding. I think we've both been carrying a lot of guilt, a lot of pain. But we can't keep punishing ourselves. We need to forgive ourselves and each other if we're going to move forward. Forgiveness. It was a word that held so much power, so much promise, but also so much difficulty. I knew she was right, that without forgiveness, the past would continue to haunt us, to poison whatever future we might have together. But saying it was easier than doing it. I want to forgive, Elena, I said, my voice trembling slightly. But it's hard. It's hard to let go of everything that's happened, of all the hurt. She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. I know it is. And it's not something that can happen overnight. But maybe we can start, little by little. We don't have to do it all at once. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire, the warmth of the room contrasting with the coolness of the night outside. It was in that silence that I felt a shift, a subtle but significant change in the air between us. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about understanding, about seeing each other for who we really were, flaws and all, and choosing to move forward anyway. Elena, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I'm willing to try. I want us to find our way back to each other. She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw the same determination, the same fragile hope that I felt within myself. I want that too, Dominic, more than anything. And so, we began the long road to healing, one step at a time. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of our past threatened to drag us down, when old wounds would reopen and the pain would feel as fresh as ever. But there were also days of light, of laughter, of rediscovering the reasons we had fallen in love in the first place. We sought help too, knowing that we couldn't do this alone. Therapy became a regular part of our lives, a place where we could explore the deeper issues that had led us to where we were. It was difficult, sometimes excruciating, to lay everything bare, to confront the darkest parts of ourselves and our relationship. But it was also liberating, a way of unburdening ourselves from the past and finding new ways to connect, to communicate. Through it all, I learned to be patient, to give Elena the space she needed to heal in her own time. And she, in turn, began to trust me again, to let me in where once she had shut me out. It was a slow process, but with each small victory, each moment of connection, the walls between us grew a little thinner. One night, months after we had begun this journey of healing, I found myself standing in our bedroom, watching as Elena prepared for bed. There was a softness in her movements, a calmness that hadn't been there before. She caught my gaze in the mirror and smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Dominic, she said, turning to face me, I think we're going to be okay. I walked over to her, taking her in my arms, holding her close. I think so too, Elena. I really do. As we stood there, holding each other, the weight of the past seemed to lift, if only for a moment. We still had a long way to go, but we were on the right path. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a belief that we could truly heal, that we could rebuild our life together on a foundation that was stronger, more resilient, and more honest than before. The journey to rebuild our lives wasn't without its challenges. Trust, once broken, is a fragile thing, difficult to restore and easy to shatter again. But Elena and I were committed to the process, to the painstaking work of piecing together what had been fractured. Every day was an exercise in patience, in understanding, and in the small, deliberate acts that slowly knitted our relationship back together. One of the hardest parts was learning to communicate again, truly communicate. For so long we had been talking at each other rather than with each other, letting our fears and insecurities dictate our words. Now we made a conscious effort to listen, to really hear what the other person was saying, and to respond with empathy rather than defensiveness. We had decided that transparency would be our foundation. There would be no more secrets, no more half-truths or omissions. If something was bothering one of us, we would talk about it openly, even if it was difficult or uncomfortable. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments when old habits threatened to resurface, when the urge to retreat behind walls of silence was strong. But we pushed through, reminding ourselves that the only way forward was through honesty. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session, where we had confronted some of the deeper wounds from our past, Elena and I decided to take a walk. The air was crisp, the first signs of winter beginning to make themselves known. We walked in silence for a while, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound between us. "Dominic," Elena said after a time, breaking the silence, "there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." I turned to her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" She paused, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Ariana, about everything that led up to that night. And I realized that part of the reason I was drawn to her was because I felt like I was losing myself, like I wasn't sure who I was anymore, apart from being your wife." Her words hit me with a mix of sadness and understanding. I had known, deep down, that this was part of the problem, but hearing her say it out loud made it more real. "Elena, I'm sorry if I made you feel that way. That was never my intention." "I know," she replied, her voice soft. "But I also know that it wasn't just you. It was me too. I didn't know how to express what I was feeling, so I turned to someone who I thought could help me find myself again. But I was wrong. Ariana wasn't the answer. She just distracted me from the real issues." I nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I understand. And I think I was trying to hold on too tightly, to control things because I was afraid of losing you. But I see now that in doing that, I pushed you away." She reached out and took my hand, her touch grounding me. "We both made mistakes, Dominic, but what matters now is that we're trying to fix them together." I squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth spread through me. "You're right, and I want you to know that I'm here for you, for whatever you need. I don't want to lose you again, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that doesn't happen." She smiled, a small but genuine expression that told me we were on the right track. "I feel the same way. I want us to be a team again, to support each other, no matter what." As we continued our walk, I felt a renewed sense of hope. The path we were on wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were moving in the right direction. We were no longer fighting against each other, but with each other, working toward a common goal, rebuilding the trust that had been lost. One of the things we did to reinforce this trust was to establish new rituals, small but meaningful actions that helped us reconnect. We started having regular check-in conversations where we would sit down together and talk about how we were feeling, about our fears, our hopes, and our progress. These conversations weren't always easy. Sometimes they brought up painful memories or difficult emotions, but they were necessary. They kept us grounded in the present, focused on the future we were trying to build. We also made time for each other in ways we hadn't before. Simple things like cooking dinner together, going for walks, or even just sitting in silence while we read or watched a movie. These moments, though seemingly small, were the glue that held us together, reminders of the love and connection that had brought us together in the first place. As the months passed, I noticed a change in Elena. She was becoming more like the woman I had fallen in love with, strong, independent, but also open and vulnerable in ways she hadn't been before. And I realized that I was changing too. I was learning to let go of my need to control, to trust in the process, and to trust in her. It was a gradual process, but with each day, I felt our bond growing stronger, more resilient. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Times when the past would creep up on us, when the old wounds would ache, and the fear of falling back into old patterns would rise. But we faced those moments together with honesty and compassion, and slowly but surely they began to lose their power over us. One night, as we lay in bed, Elena turned to me, her eyes shining in the dim light. "Dominic," she whispered, "I love you." It was something she hadn't said in a long time, not like this, with such sincerity and depth of feeling. My heart swelled in my chest, and I pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. "I love you too, Elena, more than anything." In that moment, I knew that we had turned a corner. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were beginning to thrive. The trust we had rebuilt wasn't perfect. It would take time to fully heal, but it was strong enough to hold us, to carry us forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a deep sense of peace, a belief that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together as a team. The road ahead was still long, but it was a road we were now walking side by side, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came our way. And that, more than anything, gave me hope for the future. As winter began to yield to the first signs of spring, the world outside our window mirrored the changes happening within our home. The snow started to melt, revealing patches of green, and the trees, once bare and lifeless, began to show the first buds of new growth. It was a season of renewal, of fresh starts, and it seemed fitting that Elena and I were also on the cusp of something new, a new chapter in our lives, one built on the foundation we had worked so hard to rebuild. Our healing was not linear. There were still difficult days, moments when old insecurities and fears would surface, threatening to pull us back into the darkness we had fought so hard to escape. But each time, we faced those challenges together, reminding ourselves of the commitment we had made to each other. The more we talked, the more we shared our thoughts and feelings, the stronger our bond became. Trust, once so fragile, was now something we actively nurtured, understanding that it was the bedrock of our relationship. One of the most significant changes we made was deciding to leave behind the physical reminders of our past struggles. The house we had lived in for years, the place where so much had happened, both good and bad, had become a symbol of everything we had gone through. While it held memories we cherished, it also carried the weight of the pain we had experienced. We agreed that a fresh start required a new environment, a place where we could create new memories without the shadows of the past looming over us. It wasn't an easy decision. Moving meant letting go of the familiar, of the comfort that comes with knowing every creak in the floorboards, every corner of the yard. But it also meant letting go of the pain, of the constant reminders of what we had been through. So, we began the process of finding a new home, one that would represent the next phase of our journey together. After weeks of searching, we found it, a charming house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and bathed in sunlight. It was smaller than our previous home, but it felt right. It felt like a place where we could breathe, where we could start over. The moment we stepped inside, we both knew it was where we were meant to be. Moving day was bittersweet. As we packed up our belongings, we found ourselves reminiscing about the good times we had shared in our old home. The laughter, the celebrations, the moments of quiet contentment. But we also knew that it was time to move forward, to create a new space where those memories could coexist with the future we were building. Our first night in the new house was a quiet one. We were exhausted from the move, but there was a sense of peace that settled over us as we sat together in the living room, surrounded by boxes that still needed unpacking. The house was filled with the scent of fresh paint, the walls bare and waiting to be adorned with the art and photos that had once decorated our old home. Elena curled up next to me on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. "It feels different here," she said softly, her voice filled with a sense of wonder. "It does," I agreed, wrapping my arm around her. "It feels lighter, like we've left the weight of everything behind." She nodded, and I could feel the tension that had once been a constant presence in her slowly fading away. "I think this is what we needed, Dominic. A new place to start over, to build something new." I kissed the top of her head, feeling a deep sense of contentment. I think so too. This is our new beginning. In the weeks that followed, we settled into our new home, taking our time to decorate and make it our own. Each room became a reflection of who we were becoming, of the life we were creating together. We filled the walls with photos of our happiest moments, reminders of the love that had always been there, even when we had lost sight of it. We also made a conscious effort to bring more joy into our lives, to focus on the things that made us happy. We started new traditions: Saturday morning breakfasts on the porch, evening walks in the nearby woods, movie nights where we would curl up together and lose ourselves in a story. These simple moments, these acts of connection, became the foundation of our new life. One day, as we were unpacking the last of the boxes, Alina found an old photo album buried at the bottom. It was from our early years together, filled with pictures of our first dates, our wedding, and the adventures we had shared in the beginning of our relationship. We sat down together, flipping through the pages, laughing at the memories, and marveling at how much we had changed. "We've been through so much," Alina said, her voice tinged with both nostalgia and gratitude. "But looking at these pictures, it reminds me of why we fell in love in the first place." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "And why we're still in love, even after everything." She leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that was filled with the promise of all the tomorrows we would share. "Here's to all the new memories we're going to make," she whispered, her eyes shining with hope. "Here's to us," I replied, feeling the warmth spread through me, a sense of completeness that I hadn't felt in a long time. As we sat there, surrounded by the remnants of our past and the beginnings of our future, I realized that this was what it meant to rebuild, to truly start over. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and then choosing to move forward with love and understanding. We had faced the darkness together, and now we were stepping into the light. Our journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt. But I knew that we were stronger now, more resilient. We had chosen each other again and again, and that choice had made all the difference. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, our new beginning became our new normal. The house that had once been empty and quiet was now filled with laughter, with the sounds of a life being lived fully and joyfully. And in those moments, I knew that we had found our way back to each other, that we had rebuilt something beautiful from the ashes of what had been. We were no longer just surviving. We were thriving. And as I looked at Alina, at the woman I had loved for so long, I knew that this was only the beginning of the next chapter in our story. A chapter filled with love, trust, and the unshakable belief that no matter what came our way, we would face it together.